Welcome, dear friends, to St. Mary Mead. Before we step through the frost-laced gates of Ashcombe Hall, settle in, pour yourself something warm, pull the blanket a little higher, because tonight's tale is not one you'll want to walk through with the lights on. You already know her, of course. That quiet, silver-haired woman knitting by the fire, the one everyone underestimates until it's far too late. Miss Jane Marple has seen more of human nature in her small English village than most detectives see in a lifetime of chasing criminals through city streets. And she has learned, better than anyone, that the coldest hearts often live behind the warmest smiles. This is the longest night of the year. The candles are lit, the sherry poured, old grudges are being toasted along with old friendships. And somewhere in that grand hall, a man who was buried 3 days ago is about to lift his glass and smile at the room as if death were merely an inconvenience he'd stepped around. If you're new here, welcome. Make yourself comfortable, because we tell stories the old way, slowly, carefully, with every detail earning its place before the final truth is laid bare. And if you've walked with Miss Marple before, on some other winter's evening, in some other quiet English house where nothing was quite what it seemed, welcome back. You know how these nights end, you just don't know how they begin. So draw the curtains. The frost is thickening on the windows of Ashcombe Hall, the guests are gathering, and somewhere among them sits a man who should not be alive. Let us go in. Part 1. The invitation. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, tucked between a seed catalogue and a rather stern note from the vicar's wife about the flower rota, and Miss Marple almost missed it entirely. It was the weight of the paper that caught her attention first. Thick, cream-coloured, the sort of stationery that announced money before a single word was read. She set down her knitting, adjusted her spectacles, and slit the envelope with the small silver knife she kept for exactly this purpose. Dear Miss Marple, you will forgive the informality of this invitation, arriving as it does with rather less notice than good manners would prescribe. My father, Colonel Ashcombe, has asked most particularly that you join us for the winter solstice dinner at Ashcombe Hall this Friday next. He remembers you fondly from the Fenwick affair some years past and has said, in his own words, that a house full of family is a house that wants a clear pair of eyes in it. I confess I do not entirely understand what he means by this, but I have learned not to argue with my father when he takes a notion. We would be glad of your company. Yours sincerely, Eleanor Ashcombe. Miss Marple read it twice, then set it on her lap and looked out at the garden, where the last of the autumn asters had gone black and papery with the first hard frost. A house full of family that wants a clear pair of eyes in it. She knew Colonel Ashcombe only slightly, a big, blustering man with a laugh like a shotgun, and a way of watching people from beneath heavy white brows that suggested he missed considerably less than he let on. If he had asked for her by name, he had a reason, and the Colonel was not a man given to whims. She wrote back that same afternoon, accepting. Ashcombe Hall sat at the end of a long gravel drive lined with bare-limbed oaks, and it looked, in the fading 4 o'clock light of the Friday she arrived, exactly like the sort of house that had accumulated too much history for its own good. Grey stone, mullioned windows glowing amber against the early dark, smoke rising thick and steady from a dozen chimneys. Miss Marple stepped down from the hired car with her small case and stood for a moment simply looking at it, the way she might study a face for the first time, cataloguing what it chose to show and wondering, quietly, what it was hiding. It was Eleanor who met her at the door, a slim woman in her 30s, with prematurely grey streaks at her temples and the particular brittleness of someone who had spent years managing other people's tempers. Her handshake was firm, but her eyes kept sliding past Miss Marple's shoulder, toward the house behind her, as though checking that nothing had shifted in her absence. Miss Marple, thank you so much for coming on such short notice. Father will be delighted. He's been asking after you since Tuesday, practically counting the hours. A small, tired laugh. Do come in out of the cold. We're rather a full house this year. The full house revealed itself over the course of the next hour, as Miss Marple was shown to a comfortable room overlooking the frozen rose garden, and then brought down, once changed, to the drawing room, where the family had gathered before dinner. There was the Colonel himself, larger than she remembered, settled in a wing chair by the fire with a glass of whisky and an expression of forced good cheer that didn't quite reach his eyes. There was Eleanor's younger brother, Rupert, a restless young man of perhaps 26, who could not seem to stay seated for more than a few minutes at a stretch, and who refilled his glass twice in the time it took Miss Marple to accept a small sherry of her own. There was an aunt, Colonel Ashcombe's sister, a Mrs. Prudence Yelverton, sharp-chinned and sharper-eyed, who studied Miss Marple with the frank curiosity of a woman deciding whether a newcomer was worth her attention. And there was, standing rather apart near the tall windows with a glass he did not seem to be drinking from, a solicitor by the name of Mr. Henry Vance, whom nobody troubled to explain the presence of, which told Miss Marple a good deal in itself. But it was the 13th place at the table that Miss Marple noticed first, because she counted, she always counted. It was a habit as old as her memory of dinner parties, and the number did not sit easily. 13 chairs. 13 settings of the family silver, gleaming under the candlelight, though when she was introduced to each person in turn, she could only account for 6 living souls in the room, plus herself, plus the promise of a 7th guest not yet arrived. "We're expecting one more," Eleanor said, following her gaze to the empty chair at the foot of the table, the one nearest the fire, the one that had been laid with a care that suggested it mattered rather more than the others. A family friend. He's staying nearby and will join us before dinner is served." There was something in the way she said family friend that made the words sound borrowed, as though she were reciting a line she had been given, rather than a fact she believed. The Colonel, from his chair by the fire, made a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been a cough, and took a long pull from his whisky. 13 at table, said Mrs. Yelverton, into the small silence that followed. Unlucky, some would say. I've never held with the superstition myself, but my mother would have had a fit. Then it is fortunate, Miss Marple said mildly, settling into the chair she had been shown to, that your mother is not here to see it. It was meant and taken as a small pleasantry, and the conversation moved on to safer ground, the weather, the likelihood of snow before Christmas, whether the roads would hold. But Miss Marple, sipping her sherry with the appearance of placid enjoyment, found her attention returning again and again to that 13th chair, and to the particular quality of stillness that had settled over the room the moment Eleanor mentioned the guest who had not yet arrived. Rupert had gone very carefully to refill his glass a 3rd time, not meeting anyone's eye. The Colonel's jaw had tightened beneath his white moustache, and Mr. Henry Vance, the solicitor by the window, had turned to look out at the darkening garden with the particular blankness of a man who has schooled his face very deliberately into showing nothing at all. Miss Marple had attended a great many dinner parties in her long life, in a great many houses, and she had learned that the truest conversations were rarely the ones spoken aloud. It was the silences that mattered, the pause half a second too long, the glance exchanged and then hastily withdrawn, the question nobody quite dared to ask. And here, in this warm and handsome room, with its crackling fire and its gleaming silver, she counted no fewer than 4 such silences in the space of 10 minutes, each one gathering like a held breath around that single empty chair. She thought, not for the first time, that Colonel Ashcombe's odd little phrase in Eleanor's letter, "a house that wants a clear pair of eyes in it," had been rather more precisely chosen than his daughter understood. Outside, the last grey light was draining from the sky, and the first flakes of the promised snow had begun, very softly, to fall against the tall windows. Somewhere down the long gravel drive, headlamps swept briefly across the bare oaks and vanished again into the dusk. A car, approaching the house, though from where Miss Marple sat, she could not yet see whose. She folded her hands in her lap and waited, with the patient stillness of a woman who has learned that the most important things in a room reveal themselves only to those willing to be quiet long enough to notice. The 13th chair sat empty at the table, waiting too. Part 2. The Man Who Should Not Be. The sound of the front door reached the drawing room before the man himself did. A gust of cold air, the low murmur of the housekeeper's voice, footsteps in the hall unhurried in a way that struck Miss Marple as almost theatrical, as though their owner knew perfectly well that every person in that drawing-room was listening for them. Eleanor rose from her chair too quickly, smoothing her skirt with hands that were not quite steady. "That will be him," she said, to no one in particular, and went to the door. Miss Marple did not rise. She had found, over many years of observing rooms rather than participating in them, that stillness revealed more than movement ever could, and so she remained exactly where she was, her sherry glass resting untouched in her lap, and watched the faces of the 6 people gathered around her rather than the door itself. The Colonel's hand, she noted, had tightened around the arm of his chair until the knuckles showed white. Rupert had stopped mid-motion in the act of lifting his glass, and did not complete the gesture. Mrs. Yelverton's sharp eyes had gone very wide and very fixed, and her lips had parted slightly, as though she meant to speak and had forgotten how. And Mr. Henry Vance, the solicitor, had turned from the window at last, and his face, in that unguarded instant before he composed it, wore an expression Miss Marple had seen only twice before in her long life, on the faces of men confronted with something their reason told them was impossible. Then the door opened, and the man walked in, and Miss Marple understood. He was perhaps 50, well-built, with a full head of dark hair silvering handsomely at the temples, and the easy, confident bearing of a man accustomed to being welcomed wherever he went. He wore a dinner jacket of excellent cut, and carried himself with the faint, pleasant amusement of someone arriving fashionably late to his own celebration. He crossed to the fire, rubbing his hands together against the cold, and smiled around at the assembled company with perfect good humour. "Frightful roads," he said. "I very nearly turned back twice. Eleanor, my dear, you didn't tell me it would be quite such a production getting here." His eyes found Miss Marple unfamiliar to him, and he inclined his head with easy courtesy. "And I don't believe we've met. Julian Faircross. I don't suppose anyone's told you what a dreadful imposition I am on this family's Christmas." Nobody laughed. Nobody spoke at all, for what felt to Miss Marple like a very long moment, though it could not have been more than 3 or 4 seconds. She had heard the name before, not from anyone in this room, but 3 days earlier, in the small, cold churchyard of St. Mary Mead, where she had stood at the edge of a modest gathering of mourners and watched a coffin lowered into frozen ground, while the vicar read the service in a voice made thin by the wind. She had gone, as she went to most funerals in the county, less from close acquaintance than from the quiet conviction that a person's death, and the manner in which others received it, told one a great deal about the shape of a life. The dead man had been a solicitor from the nearby town of Middlebrook, connected, she now recalled, with a small, cold settling of certainty in her chest, to some family business concerning the Ashcombe estate. His name, printed in careful black ink on the order of service she still had folded in her handbag upstairs, had been Julian Faircross. She had watched the earth close over that coffin herself. She had spoken, briefly, with the undertaker, a Mr. Pruitt of Pruitt and Sons, whom she had known for a decade and who did not make mistakes about which body went into which grave. There was no possibility of confusion, no error of names, no unfortunate coincidence of 2 men sharing an uncommon surname in a small county. She had seen Julian Faircross buried on Tuesday morning beneath a grey December sky, and now, on Friday evening, Julian Faircross stood warming his hands at the fire of Ashcombe Hall, entirely alive, entirely solid, accepting a glass of sherry from a housemaid with a murmured word of thanks. Miss Marple set down her own glass very carefully, aware that her hand, unlike the others in the room, remained perfectly steady, and that this steadiness was itself a kind of advantage. She was, after all, the only person present who had not yet had 3 days to prepare a face for this moment. "Mr. Faircross," she said, in the same mild tone she might have used to remark upon the weather, "how very good of you to join us." If he heard anything unusual in her voice, he gave no sign of it. "The pleasure's entirely mine, miss. I'm afraid I didn't catch the name." "Marple. Jane Marple." Something flickered behind his eyes, so brief, so well controlled, that had she not spent a lifetime watching for exactly such flickers, she might have missed it entirely. But it was there, and gone, replaced instantly by the same easy charm. "Miss Marple. Of course. The Colonel's spoken of you." He raised his glass slightly, an informal toast. "To old acquaintances, then." Around the room, the others had begun, with visible effort, to resume the appearance of normal conversation, Rupert draining his glass in a single swallow and reaching immediately for the decanter, Mrs. Yelverton fanning herself with unnecessary vigour, despite the coolness of the hall, the colonel clearing his throat and remarking loudly on the likelihood of snow settling by morning. Only Eleanor remained silent, standing near the door with her hands clasped so tightly together that the knuckles had gone bloodless, watching Julian Faircross with an expression Miss Marple could not entirely read. Not surprise, precisely, because surprise had already had 3 days to become something else. Something closer to dread, carefully suppressed. She knew, Miss Marple thought. She has known since before I arrived. That is why the letter came on such short notice. That is why the colonel wanted a clear pair of eyes in the house. The dinner gong sounded from the hall beyond, deep and resonant, and the small gathering began to move toward the dining room with the studied normalcy of people determined not to acknowledge the impossible thing that had just walked in among them. Miss Marple rose last, smoothing her skirts, and found Mr. Henry Vance falling into step beside her as they crossed the hall. "You knew him," she said quietly, not quite a question. "Before tonight." The solicitor's face, for just a moment, lost its careful composure. "I drew up his will, Miss Marple," he said, very low, 11 months ago. "And 3 days ago I attended his funeral, along with half the county, and read the eulogy myself." He glanced ahead to where Julian Faircross walked at Eleanor's side, toward the candlelit table, laughing easily at some remark of the colonel's. "I do not know what that is walking into the dining room tonight, but I can assure you, on my professional oath, that I buried Julian Faircross on Tuesday morning, and I watched them fill in the grave myself." Miss Marple looked ahead at the 13th chair, no longer empty, and at the man now lowering himself into it, with the easy confidence of someone entirely certain of his welcome. "Then, Mr. Vance," she said softly, "I think we had both better pay very close attention to what is served at this table tonight, because someone in this house has gone to a great deal of trouble to raise the dead, and I do not imagine they intend to stop at dinner." The candles flickered as the door to the dining room swung shut behind them, and outside, the snow continued to fall, steady and silent, sealing Ashcombe Hall off from the rest of the world. Part 3. What the Silver Knew. The dining room at Ashcombe Hall was a long, handsome chamber, panelled in dark oak and hung with portraits of Ashcombe's long dead, stern men in hunting pink, pale women in high-collared silk, all of them watching the table below with the flat, painted indifference of the departed. A fire roared at either end of the room, and the long table between them glittered with silver and crystal, candles burning in tall brass holders down its centre, so that the 13 places were lit not by electric light, but by that older, more unsettling illumination that throws long shadows and makes a face across the table seem, at certain angles, almost unfamiliar. Miss Marple found herself seated between Mrs. Yelverton and Mr. Vance, with a clear view down the table to where Julian Faircross sat at the colonel's right hand, engaged in easy conversation about the state of the roads, as though he had not, 3 days prior, been lowered into 6 feet of frozen Hampshire clay. She began, as she always began, with the small things. The soup arrived, a rich, dark oxtail, served by a young footman whose hands, she noted, trembled very slightly as he set the bowl before Mr. Faircross, so that a few drops splashed onto the white cloth. The footman was new, she thought, or at least new to serving this particular guest, and his nervousness was the nervousness of a man who has been told something troubling and instructed not to show it. "You'll forgive Thomas," the colonel said, following her glance. "New to the house, all fingers and thumbs still." "Not at all," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "I find a little nervousness in service rather reassuring. It suggests the staff still feel the weight of the occasion." Julian Faircross laughed at this, a warm, easy sound. "Well said, Miss Marple, though I confess I feel rather the cause of everyone's nerves tonight. Eleanor's barely looked at me since I walked in." He turned to her with the same easy charm he had shown all evening, though Miss Marple noted that his eyes, when they rested on Eleanor, held something considerably harder than charm, a watchfulness, carefully veiled, that reminded her of nothing so much as a man checking that a debt was still being honoured. Eleanor, at the far end of the table, did not look up from her soup. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean, Julian." "No," he said softly, "I'm sure you don't." It was a small exchange, over almost before it began, and the conversation moved on, Rupert asking too loudly about hunting prospects for the new year, Mrs. Yelverton recounting some lengthy anecdote about a solstice dinner 30 years past. But Miss Marple set it carefully alongside everything else she had gathered, the way one sets a stitch into a pattern not yet fully visible. She had, by the second course, begun to form the shape of several small observations, each unremarkable alone, each considerably more interesting in combination. The first was this: Julian Faircross ate and drank with evident appetite, and yet Miss Marple, watching closely, noted that his glass was refilled rather more often by his own hand than by the footman's, and that he chose, each time, to pour from the same decanter, a claret set nearest his elbow, rather than the bottle circulating the table, a small thing. A traveller's habit, perhaps, born of caution on unfamiliar roads, or something else. The second was the Colonel himself, who drank steadily and heavily throughout the meal, in a manner Miss Marple recognised. Not the drinking of a man enjoying his solstice dinner, but the drinking of a man attempting to blur something he did not wish to look at too closely. He laughed loudly at small jokes and fell silent, several times, in the middle of sentences, his eyes drifting to Julian Faircross with an expression that was not quite fear and not quite fury, but some uneasy mixture of the two. The third was Rupert, who had said almost nothing of substance all evening, and who Miss Marple noticed, glancing down the table during a lull in conversation, was not eating at all, merely moving his food about his plate with the studied appearance of a man performing the motions of a meal he had no appetite for, while his eyes flicked, again and again, toward the door. And the fourth, the detail that troubled her most, though she could not yet say precisely why, was Eleanor's hands. Throughout the meal, Eleanor Ashcombe had touched nothing at her place-setting that she did not need to. Her wine-glass remained untouched, her water-glass barely sipped, and when the second course was cleared, Miss Marple noticed that Eleanor's napkin, spread properly in her lap at the meal's beginning, had by now been twisted, beneath the table's edge, into a tight and mangled rope. "You're not eating, my dear," Mrs. Yelverton observed to Eleanor, not unkindly, from across the table. "You've hardly touched a thing all evening." "I'm not very hungry, Aunt Prudence," Eleanor said, and her voice, though carefully controlled, had the thin, brittle quality of glass under pressure. It was Julian Faircross who spoke next, and something in his tone, light, almost teasing, but with an edge beneath it that only Miss Marple perhaps was positioned to hear, made the whole table's attention turn toward him. "You mustn't fret so, Eleanor. I did warn you I'm difficult to be rid of." He smiled, raising his glass slightly. "A man in my position learns to be rather resilient." The silence that followed this remark lasted perhaps 2 seconds too long. The Colonel's carving knife, which he had been using to divide the roast, stopped mid-motion. Rupert's fork clattered, very softly, against his plate. And Mr. Henry Vance, beside Miss Marple, set down his own glass with a control so deliberate it was itself a kind of statement. "A curious turn of phrase, Mr. Faircross," Miss Marple said into the silence, her voice as mild and unhurried as ever, "for a man attending a solstice dinner among friends." Julian Faircross turned his gaze to her, and for the first time that evening, the easy charm slipped entirely from his face, replaced by something colder and more assessing. The look, she thought, of a man taking the true measure of an opponent for the first time. "I find," he said slowly, "that I don't entirely know what to make of you, Miss Marple. The Colonel didn't mention you'd be quite so observant." "I am an old woman who has attended a great many dinner parties, Mr. Faircross," she said pleasantly, "and I have found, over the years, that people say a great deal more than they intend to, particularly around the second course. It is one of the small compensations of growing old. Nobody troubles to guard their tongue in front of you, because nobody imagines you are paying attention." Something in his expression shifted then, not quite alarm, but a recalculation, swift and silent, as though he had just moved a piece on some private chessboard and found the position considerably less favourable than he had believed a moment before. The roast was cleared. The candles had burned down perhaps an inch since the meal began, their wax pooling in thin, pale rivers down the brass holders, and outside the tall windows The snow had thickened into a steady, silent fall that had already begun to soften the hard black lines of the bare oaks along the drive. Miss Marple, folding her hands in her lap as the next course was announced, found herself certain of only one thing with any real confidence: that whatever had brought a dead man to this table tonight, it was not friendship, and it was not chance, and that at least 3 people seated around this gleaming, candle-lit silver knew considerably more about the reason for his resurrection than any of them intended to say. She would, she decided, have to find a way of making them say it anyway. Part 4. The Study After Dinner. Dinner concluded, as such evenings do, with a dessert nobody quite tasted, and a round of coffee taken with the particular stiffness of a company eager to disperse. It was Colonel Ashcombe who broke the pattern of the evening, rising rather abruptly from his chair as the last plates were cleared, and announcing, in a voice pitched for the whole table, that he would take his coffee in the study, and that he should be very glad if Miss Marple would join him there. "A little business, my dear," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. "Nothing that need concern the rest of you." It was not, Miss Marple thought, an invitation so much as an extraction, and she accepted it as such, rising with practised ease and following the Colonel's broad back out of the dining room, down a short panelled corridor, and into a study that smelled of pipe tobacco and old leather, and faintly, beneath it, of something like fear. The Colonel closed the door behind them with unusual care, as though testing that it would hold, and gestured her toward a deep armchair by the fire, before lowering himself, heavily, into the one opposite. For a long moment he said nothing at all, simply staring into the flames with the white brows drawn low over eyes that had lost, entirely, the blustering good cheer he had worn like armour throughout the meal. "You attended his funeral," the Colonel said at last. It was not a question. "I did." "Then you'll understand," he said, "why I asked Eleanor to write to you." He rubbed a hand across his face, and for the first time Miss Marple saw, beneath the bluff exterior, an old man badly frightened. "I have fought in 2 wars, Miss Marple. I have seen things no man ought to see and slept soundly enough after. But I watched Julian Faircross lowered into the ground on Tuesday morning. I stood not 10 feet from his grave, and tonight he sat at my table and ate my food and made his little jokes. And I tell you plainly, I do not know what manner of thing has walked into my house." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said gently, "we ought to begin with what manner of man he was, before he became whatever he is now. It is generally easier to understand the second question once one has answered the first." The Colonel was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had dropped lower, as though he feared being overheard even here, behind a closed door, in his own study. "Julian Faircross handled the family's legal affairs for the better part of 15 years. My father trusted him, and I trusted him after, more fool me. He drew up my will. He managed the estate accounts. He knew, Miss Marple, every debt this family has ever owed, and every secret we've ever tried to keep quiet. And about 18 months ago, I began to suspect he was using that knowledge for rather more than his legitimate fees." "Blackmail," Miss Marple said, without inflection. The Colonel flinched slightly at the word, but did not deny it. "I couldn't prove it, not in any way that would stand up. But money was leaving this estate that I could not account for, and it was leaving in a pattern that matched, rather too closely, certain indiscretions within my own family. Rupert's gambling debts. A foolish entanglement of Eleanor's some years back, before her marriage, that she would very much prefer forgotten. Even my own affairs, from a time I am not proud of." He met her eyes at last. Faircross knew all of it, and I believe, though I cannot swear to it, that he had begun making rather pointed use of that knowledge. "And then he died," Miss Marple said quietly. "And then he died. Motor accident, on the Middlebrook Road, late on a wet evening. Nothing suspicious about it at the time. I confess I felt something rather closer to relief than grief, God forgive me, when I heard the news. The county doctor signed the certificate. Pruitt handled the burial. I stood at his graveside and told myself the family's troubles had been buried with him. His hands, resting on the arms of his chair, had curled into fists, and now he sits at my table, 3 days later, whole and smiling, and makes his little remarks about being difficult to be rid of. And I do not know, Miss Marple, whether I am looking at a resurrection or a very cruel and very elaborate lie." Miss Marple considered this in silence for a moment, watching the fire settle and spark in the grate. "You said the county doctor signed the certificate," she said at length. "Might I ask which doctor?" "Dr. Hollis. Young fellow, been in the district only a year or two. Why do you ask?" "Because," Miss Marple said, "a man who has faked his own death requires several things to succeed. A body that can pass, at a distance, for his own. A doctor willing, whether through deception or complicity, to sign a false certificate. An undertaker prepared not to look too closely at what he buries. And, above all, a reason compelling enough to justify so extraordinary a deception." "You have given me a very clear picture of the reason, Colonel. A man who held this family's secrets and had begun, perhaps, to fear that his hold on them was weakening, perhaps because someone had discovered his scheme and threatened exposure in return, might find it considerably safer to vanish than to be caught, and safer still to vanish in a manner that placed him, quite literally, beyond suspicion." The Colonel stared at her. "You mean he arranged his own funeral, faked his own death, to escape whatever trouble was closing in on him, and now means to resurface once the danger's passed, and resume his hold over us as though nothing at all had happened?" "It is one possibility among several," Miss Marple said carefully, "and I should be reluctant to settle on it too quickly. There is another matter that troubles me rather more, Colonel, and I think you have already sensed it yourself, or you would not have looked quite so unhappy throughout dinner." "What's that?" "If Mr. Faircross faked his death to escape a threat," Miss Marple said, "then the threat he was escaping has not gone away simply because he vanished for 3 days. It has merely been waiting, Colonel, waiting, quite patiently, for him to reappear. And I could not help but notice, at your table this evening, that a great many people in this house seemed considerably less surprised to see him alive than genuine astonishment would produce. Surprise announces itself in the body before the mind can master it. A gasp, a dropped fork, a hand flown to the throat. What I saw tonight around your table was not surprise, it was dread. And dread, Colonel, is what a person feels not when the impossible occurs, but when a fear they have been quietly carrying is finally, terribly confirmed." The fire cracked and settled in the grate. Outside the study window, the snow continued its steady fall, and somewhere beyond the closed door, Miss Marple could hear, faint and indistinct, the low murmur of voices from the drawing-room. Julian Faircross's easy laugh rising once above the rest, and beneath it, cut short almost as soon as it began, what might have been Eleanor Ashcombe's voice, sharp and frightened, hushed a moment later by someone she could not identify. The Colonel had heard it too. He rose from his chair with the stiffness of a much older man, crossed to the study door and opened it a careful inch, listening. "Miss Marple," he said quietly, without turning, "I begin to fear that whatever brought Julian Faircross back from his grave tonight, it was not friendship for this family, and I do not think, whatever is coming, that we have very much time left to understand it before it arrives." Part 5. The Voice in the Corridor. Miss Marple rose from her chair at once, and the Colonel, still holding the study door ajar, stepped back to let her pass. The corridor beyond was dim, lit only by a single wall sconce and the faint amber wash of firelight spilling from the drawing-room at its far end, and it was from that direction, muffled by distance and the thick oak panelling of the old house, that the voices continued, low and urgent, rising occasionally into something sharper before dropping again into a hush that was, in its own way, more troubling than any raised word could have been. "We ought not to eavesdrop," the Colonel murmured, though he made no move to return to his study, and Miss Marple noted, with the small private amusement she permitted herself in such moments, that men who declared they ought not to do a thing very often did it anyway, provided someone else moved first. She moved first, walking with unhurried steps down the corridor, close enough to the wall that her shadow would not fall across the strip of light beneath the drawing-room door. The Colonel followed, considerably less quietly, and together they came to a halt just beyond the threshold, where the voices resolved themselves into words. "You cannot simply walk back into this house as though nothing happened," Eleanor was saying, her careful composure entirely gone now, replaced by something raw and close to breaking. 3 days, Julian. 3 days I have sat in that church and told myself it was over, that whatever hold you had over this family died with you. And now you stand in my drawing room and speak to me as though we are merely continuing a conversation from last Tuesday. We are, my dear. Julian Faircross's voice, by contrast, remained entirely level, almost gentle, the voice of a man explaining something patiently to a slow child. I never said it was over. I said I needed rather more time than I had, and that a temporary absence seemed the most efficient way of securing it. You might have shown a little more gratitude, Eleanor, that I chose to disappear quietly, rather than let the whole business come out in the open, as it very nearly did. Gratitude. Eleanor's laugh was thin and without humour. You let this family bury you. You let my father stand at your graveside and weep. Yes, he wept, Julian, whatever else you think of him. And you call that a kindness. I call it, Faircross said, and now something harder had entered his voice, a great deal more discretion than the alternative would have allowed. You ought to remember, my dear, precisely what the alternative was, and precisely who it was that came to me 18 months ago and begged, on her knees very nearly, that certain matters never reach her father's ears. I have kept my part of that arrangement rather faithfully, all things considered. I should hope, now that circumstances require my return, that you might extend the same courtesy. There was a silence, then, that lasted long enough that Miss Marple wondered if the conversation had ended, or moved beyond the range of hearing. Then Eleanor spoke again, and her voice had changed entirely, no longer raw, but flat, controlled, the voice of a woman who has finished pleading and arrived, instead, at calculation. What is it you want, Julian? Only what I have always wanted, my dear. Continuation. A quiet arrangement, exactly as before, undisturbed by any further inconvenient scrutiny. A pause. And when he spoke again, there was something almost lazy in his tone, the confidence of a man who believes he holds every card at the table. Though I confess, the last week has rather changed my calculations regarding the value of my silence. I think we might discuss rather more generous terms than we had previously settled on. You're mad, Eleanor said, very quietly. You faked your own death, and now you mean to come back and simply— I mean to survive, Eleanor, which is rather more than certain people in this house seemed inclined to let me do. His voice had dropped, and Miss Marple, straining now to catch the words, felt the Colonel beside her go very still. You do understand, don't you, why I found it necessary to vanish in the first place? Someone in this house wanted me considerably more dead than the newspapers reported me to be. I have simply taken the precaution of arranging matters so that the next attempt might prove rather more difficult to arrange. A door somewhere within the drawing room opened and closed. Footsteps, perhaps a third party entering the conversation, though the voices dropped too low, after that, for Miss Marple to follow further. She glanced at the Colonel, whose weathered face had gone the colour of old parchment, and inclined her head slightly toward the corridor behind them, a silent suggestion that they withdraw before their presence was discovered. They retreated, in careful silence, to the study, and it was only once the door was closed behind them that the Colonel spoke, his voice unsteady in a way it had not been even an hour before. Someone tried to kill him, he said. Before. That's what he meant, isn't it? Someone in this house tried to kill Julian Faircross, and his death, whatever we buried on Tuesday, was not an accident at all, but a means of escaping whoever made the attempt. It would appear so, Miss Marple said, settling herself once more into the armchair by the fire, her expression thoughtful rather than alarmed. Though I think, Colonel, we must be very careful here to distinguish between what Mr. Faircross wishes us to believe and what is actually true. A man in his position, a blackmailer whose scheme has apparently been discovered and who has gone to very great lengths to disappear and reappear on his own terms, has every reason to claim an attempt on his life. It secures him sympathy. It frames his return not as the resumption of an extortion, but as a man's justified flight from danger. It also, I think, serves a rather more practical purpose. What purpose is that? It puts every person in this house on notice, Miss Marple said, that he suspects one of them of attempting murder, and that he intends to protect himself accordingly. Which means, Colonel, that whatever arrangement he is proposing to your daughter tonight, he will very likely propose to every other member of this household in turn, framed each time as the price of his continued discretion regarding both his secrets and his suspicions. I should be very surprised if you are not summoned to a similar conversation before this evening ends." The Colonel sank into the chair opposite her, looking, for the first time since she had known him, entirely at a loss. "Then what do we do?" "We do," Miss Marple said gently, "what I imagine you hoped I might do when you asked your daughter to write that letter, Colonel. We watch, we listen, and we consider, very carefully, the particular character of a man who would rather return from the dead to renew a cruelty than simply let it lie buried, because a man who takes so great a risk to resume something is a man who believes, very deeply, that the reward is worth it. I do not think Mr. Faircross has come back to Ashcombe Hall merely for the pleasure of your company, Colonel, however much he claims otherwise at your table. I think he has come back because he believes this house still owes him a very great deal, and I think, before this night is through, we shall discover precisely how far at least one member of your family is prepared to go to ensure he does not collect it." Outside, beyond the study's frosted window, the snow had begun to fall more heavily still, and somewhere in the depths of the old house, a clock began, softly, to chime the hour. Part 6, 10 o'clock. The clock finished its chiming, 10 strokes, deep and unhurried, the kind of sound that seemed to belong to the house itself, rather than merely to the mechanism that produced it. And in the silence that followed, Miss Marple rose from her chair with the quiet decisiveness of a woman who has heard enough, sitting still. "I think, Colonel," she said, "that it would be wise for us to rejoin the others. A watched pot may never boil, and an unwatched house on a night such as this one has a way of arriving at conclusions nobody intended." They found the drawing-room considerably changed from the gathering they had left an hour before. The fire had burned low and gone unattended, and the company had rearranged itself into smaller, more private clusters. Rupert, standing alone near the window with a glass in his hand and an expression of barely suppressed agitation. Mrs. Yelverton seated stiffly on the settee, with her knitting untouched in her lap, watching the room with the sharp, assessing eyes of a woman cataloguing every tension she could not quite name. Of Eleanor and Julian Faircross there was no immediate sign, though a half-empty glass of claret sat abandoned on the side table nearest the 13th chair, and Mr. Henry Vance stood near the door, his own glass equally untouched, his gaze fixed on some middle distance that suggested his mind was very much elsewhere. "Ah, Colonel!" Mrs. Yelverton looked up as they entered, her needles resuming their motion with the automatic precision of long habit. "You've missed rather an interesting quarter of an hour. Julian took Eleanor off somewhere for what he called a private word, and Rupert has been standing at that window like a man expecting the roof to fall in ever since." "I'm perfectly fine, Aunt Prudence," Rupert said, too quickly, not turning from the window. "You've said that 4 times now, dear, and each time rather less convincingly than the last." Mrs. Yelverton's needles clicked on, but her eyes had moved to Miss Marple, sharp and frankly curious. "You'll forgive an old woman's plain speaking, Miss Marple, but I don't believe for one moment that you and the Colonel disappeared into his study for an hour to discuss the roads. Something is very wrong in this house tonight, and I confess I am rather tired of everyone pretending otherwise around me." It was, Miss Marple thought, a fair challenge, delivered with the particular bluntness of a woman old enough to have earned the right to it, and she considered her answer with care before offering it. "You are quite correct, Mrs. Yelverton. Something is very wrong in this house tonight. I wonder, though, whether you yourself might not be able to shed a little light on the matter. You have known this family a good deal longer than I have, after all, and a sister's memory of old grievances often runs a good deal deeper than a daughter's." Something shifted behind Mrs. Yelverton's sharp eyes. Not surprise, but a kind of weary recognition, as though she had been waiting all evening for someone to finally ask the question directly. "My brother has never told me the particulars," she said slowly, setting her knitting aside at last. "But I am not a fool, Miss Marple, whatever the family seems to believe. I have watched Julian Faircross visit this house perhaps a dozen times in the last 2 years, and each time he left my brother looked a little greyer, my niece a little more brittle, and my nephew, she glanced toward Rupert, who had gone very still by the window, a good deal more inclined to drink than any young man ought to be. I do not know what hold that man has over this family, but I have known, for a very long while, that it is a considerable one, and that it has been slowly killing something in this house, long before anyone put him in the ground. Rupert turned from the window then, and his face, in the low firelight, had a pinched, desperate quality that made him look considerably younger than his 26 years. "Perhaps," he said, his voice unsteady, "someone ought simply to have finished the job properly the first time." The words fell into the room like a stone into still water, and for a moment nobody moved to disturb the ripples they left behind. "Rupert," the colonel said sharply, "that is quite enough." "Is it?" Rupert's laugh was brittle, close to breaking. "Is it enough, father, when he sat at our table tonight making his little jokes about being difficult to be rid of, when he took Eleanor off not 20 minutes ago to renegotiate whatever arrangement he thinks he's owed? I am rather tired of everyone in this house behaving as though good manners will make him simply go away again." He set his glass down on the windowsill, with a hand that shook visibly. "I am going to find some air. I find I cannot breathe in this room." He left without waiting for a reply, the door swinging shut behind him with rather more force than courtesy strictly required, and Miss Marple, watching him go, filed the outburst away alongside everything else she had gathered that evening. Not yet certain what pattern it belonged to, but quite certain it belonged to one. It was Mr. Henry Vance who broke the silence that followed, crossing the room at last to where Miss Marple stood near the dying fire, his voice pitched low enough that it would not carry to the settee, where Mrs. Yelverton had resumed her knitting, with rather less composure than before. "Miss Marple," he said, "I think you ought to know that Rupert Ashcombe owes considerably more in gambling debts than his father is aware of, and that Julian Faircross has, on at least 2 occasions I am personally aware of, extended him private loans against the security of his eventual inheritance, loans that Rupert has had no realistic means of repaying." He glanced toward the door through which Rupert had just departed. A young man who believes his own future has been mortgaged out from under him by a blackmailer he thought safely dead might say a great many things in a moment of frustration that he does not, strictly speaking, mean. "Or," Miss Marple said quietly, "he might mean them a great deal more than he intends anyone to realize, Mr. Vance, and the wine may simply have loosened what discretion usually keeps carefully bound." She looked toward the window through which Rupert had vanished into the dark and the snow, and beyond it, toward the corridor where, somewhere in the depths of the house, Eleanor Ashcombe was even now closeted with a man who ought, by every law of nature, to be lying quietly in the churchyard of St. Mary Mead. "I think, Mr. Vance, that we have established rather more clearly than I would have liked that this house contains no shortage of people with reason to wish Julian Faircross harm. What we have not yet established is which of them, if any, had already attempted it once before, and whether that same person, finding their first attempt so inconveniently survived, might not be tempted to try again before this night is through." Somewhere beyond the drawing-room, faint but unmistakable, came the sound of a door slamming, and a moment later footsteps, quick, uneven, hurrying, crossing the hall toward the front of the house. Miss Marple set down her sherry glass, no longer feigning the placid enjoyment of an evening's entertainment, and moved toward the door. "I think," she said, "we had better find out precisely what has just happened, before the night decides the matter for us." Part 7. What the Snow Concealed. The hall, when Miss Marple reached it, stood empty and cold, the front door swinging very slightly on its hinges where someone had gone out into the night without troubling to close it properly behind them. Snow had already begun to drift in a thin white tongue across the flagstones, and beyond the threshold, the darkness was thick and close, broken only by the faint glow of a lamp burning in an upstairs window and the pale, ghostly shapes of the bare oaks lining the drive. The colonel arrived at her shoulder a moment later, breathing hard from the effort of hurrying down the corridor, and behind him came Mr. Vance and Mrs. Yelverton, the latter with a shawl clutched hastily about her shoulders. "Rupert," the colonel said, staring at the open door. "He must have gone out this way." "Or someone did," Miss Marple said quietly. and stepped out into the cold before anyone could stop her. The snow lay perhaps 2 inches deep across the drive already, soft and unmarked in most places, but close to the door, a confusion of footprints told a clearer story than any of them had yet managed to piece together indoors. One set leading out from the house at a hurried, uneven pace, consistent with a young man walking fast and unsteady with drink and distress. And crossing it, a second set, considerably fainter, as though laid down somewhat earlier and already beginning to fill with fresh snow, leading not away from the house, but around its western side, toward the dark mass of the old rose garden and the low stone wall that marked the edge of the formal grounds. "Rupert!" the colonel called into the darkness, his voice cracking with an anxiety he no longer troubled to disguise. "Rupert, where are you, boy?" There was no answer but the soft hiss of snow falling through bare branches, and Miss Marple, moving with rather more haste than her 70-odd years generally permitted, followed the fresher set of prints around the corner of the house, her small torch, retrieved, with characteristic foresight, from her handbag before she had left her room that evening, cutting a thin beam through the whirling white. They found Rupert Ashcombe some 50 yards further on, near the low wall at the garden's edge, sitting on an overturned stone bench with his head in his hands, his evening coat already dusted white with snow, shivering violently. Though whether from cold or from something considerably worse, Miss Marple could not immediately tell. "Rupert." The colonel reached him first, gripping his son's shoulder with a hand that shook nearly as badly as the young man's own. "Good God, boy, what are you doing out here? You'll catch your death." Rupert lifted his head, and in the light of Miss Marple's torch, his face was ashen, his eyes wide and fixed on something none of the rest of them could yet see. "I found him," he said, and his voice came out strange and flat, the voice of a man still catching up to what his own eyes had shown him. "I came out for air, and I found him, just there, by the wall." He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. Miss Marple, following the direction of his gaze, swept her torch beam toward the low stone wall a few yards further on, and the beam fell upon a shape half covered already by the steadily falling snow, a man's shape, sprawled awkwardly against the base of the wall, one arm flung out at an unnatural angle, dark hair now dusted white, a dinner jacket of excellent cut visible beneath the thin, settling drift. Julian Faircross lay quite still, and this time, Miss Marple thought, moving toward him with the careful, deliberate steps of a woman who had seen death before and knew better than to disturb its scene, there could be no mistaking the matter for theatre or deception. She knelt, with some difficulty, beside the body, and pressed 2 fingers gently to the side of his throat, though the stillness of him, and the particular waxen quality already settling over his open, staring eyes, told her, before her fingers confirmed it, that there was no pulse to find. "He's dead," she said quietly, rising with the colonel's assistance. "And this time, Colonel, I do not believe we shall find it quite so easy to arrange a convenient resurrection." Mrs. Yelverton had reached them by now, and let out a small, sharp cry at the sight, one hand flying to her mouth. Mr. Vance, a step behind her, went very still, his professional composure struggling visibly against something rawer beneath it. "How?" the colonel began, and could not finish. Miss Marple crouched again, more slowly this time, examining what the torchlight and the thin covering of snow would allow her to see without disturbing the body further. There was a dark stain, already crusting at its edges beneath the fresh white powder, spreading from beneath Faircross's head, where it had come to rest against the base of the stone wall, and beside it, half buried already, a smooth, heavy stone, roughly the size of a large fist, that did not appear to belong naturally to the wall's construction. "A blow to the head," she said, "delivered, I should think, with considerable force, and very possibly with that stone you see there, though we must leave that determination properly to a doctor, and I think, Colonel, that a doctor is precisely what we require now, along with the county police, and with as little further disturbance to this ground as we can manage in the meantime." She rose fully, brushing snow from her skirts, and looked around at the small, shocked circle gathered in the darkness. The colonel, ashen and unsteady, Mrs. Yelverton, trembling beneath her shawl, Mr. Vance, his jaw tight with the effort of composure, and Rupert, still seated on the overturned bench, staring at the body of the man he had, not an hour before, declared aloud that someone ought to have properly finished off. "I did not do this," Rupert said suddenly, into the silence, his voice rising towards something close to panic. "Whatever any of you are thinking, I did not do this. I found him. I swear to you, I found him exactly as he is now." "Nobody has accused you of anything, Rupert," Miss Marple said, gently but firmly, "though I will say that a young man who declares, quite loudly and in front of witnesses, that someone ought to finish a job improperly begun, and who is then discovered alone beside that same man's body scarcely half an hour later, will find himself required to answer a great many uncomfortable questions before this night is through. Questions I think we would all do well to let the proper authorities ask, rather than attempting to settle the matter for ourselves out here in the cold and the dark." She looked back toward the house, its windows glowing warm and amber through the falling snow, deceptively peaceful against the scene the darkness had concealed at its edges, and felt the particular, familiar weight settle over her that always arrived at this point in such affairs, the knowledge that a death, once real and no longer capable of theatrical reversal, changed the character of every question that had come before it. "We must go back inside," she said. "The Colonel will telephone the police, and no one at all, is to touch anything further out here until they arrive. And I think, before this night ends, we are going to discover that Julian Faircross's return from the grave was never truly about resuming his old arrangements at all." She looked once more at the still, snow-dusted shape by the wall, at the dark stain already vanishing beneath the steadily falling white, erasing, moment by moment, whatever further evidence the ground might have offered them. "I think he came back to Ashcombe Hall tonight because he believed himself, for the first time in a great while, to be entirely safe. And I think that belief, whatever gave rise to it, was the last and most fatal mistake of his very carefully arranged life." Behind them, one by one, the lights of Ashcombe Hall seemed to dim against the thickening snow, as though the old house itself had drawn a slow, uneasy breath, and was waiting, with the rest of them, for morning. Part 8. The Longest Night's End. The police arrived a little after midnight, in the person of a stolid, unhurried inspector named Craddock from the Middlebrook Constabulary, a man whose broad, patient face and habit of writing everything down in a small notebook reminded Miss Marple, not unfavourably, of several capable officers she had assisted in years past. He examined the body by lantern light, questioned the household with methodical thoroughness, and by the time the first grey suggestion of dawn had begun to soften the darkness beyond the drawing-room windows, had established, to his own evident satisfaction, that Rupert Ashcombe's account of discovering the body could not be verified or disproven by any evidence the snow had not already erased, and that the household would, until further notice, remain confined to the hall. It was into this uneasy, exhausted lull, the fire built up again, coffee circulating among a company too shaken for sleep, that Miss Marple, some 2 hours later, quietly requested the inspector's permission to say a few words, and received it with the particular deference county policemen had learned, over the years, to extend to her. "I think," she said, standing near the fire with her hands folded before her, looking around at the small, exhausted circle of faces, "that we have all spent this night assuming the wrong question. We have asked ourselves who might have wished Julian Faircross dead a second time, when I believe the more useful question was always who could not afford to let him remain alive a second time. And those, I have come to believe, are not quite the same person." She let this settle a moment before continuing. "Mr. Faircross faked his death, as we now know, to escape an earlier attempt on his life, an attempt he strongly suspected had come from within this household. But a man planning so elaborate a deception does not undertake it alone. He requires a doctor willing to falsify a certificate, an undertaker prepared not to examine too closely what is placed in the coffin, and, most critically, someone inside the house he intends to eventually return to, who can assure him, when the time comes, that it is safe to do so." She turned, gently but unmistakably, toward Eleanor, who sat very still and very pale beside the fire. "I believe that person was you, Mrs. Ashcombe." Eleanor did not deny it. She simply closed her eyes, and something in her seemed, at last, to give way. "He came to me 18 months ago," she said, very quietly, with proof of an indiscretion I had believed long buried, a foolish entanglement before my marriage that would have destroyed my standing, and very possibly my marriage besides, had it come to light. He did not ask for money, not at first. He asked for information. Small things: who visited the house, what my father said in unguarded moments, what troubled Rupert. I told myself I was protecting my own secret. I did not fully understand, until it was far too late, that I had made myself complicit in ruining my own family from the inside. And when someone attempted his life, Miss Marple said gently, he came to you again. He told me someone had tried to kill him, struck him from behind one evening on the Middlebrook Road, though he escaped with only a glancing injury and managed to convince his own doctor, a man already in his pocket through debts of his own, to help him vanish rather than risk a second, more successful attempt before he could discover who was responsible. He asked me to help arrange his return, once he judged it safe, to tell him when the household's guard had lowered enough that he might come back and continue as before, with rather steeper terms. Her hands, in her lap, had begun to shake. I hated him for what he had made of me, but I was also, God help me, afraid of what would happen if I refused. But someone did discover the truth of his supposed death before you were ready to reveal it, Miss Marple said, which is why the invitation to me arrived on such short notice. Your father sensed something had shifted in this house, though he could not have said precisely what. It was Mr. Henry Vance, standing near the door, who spoke next, and his voice, when it came, carried the particular weight of a man who has been holding a confession behind his teeth for some hours and can no longer manage to keep it there. I discovered it, he said, 3 weeks ago. A discrepancy in the estate accounts led me to Faircross's own solicitor, and from there to certain arrangements that made no sense if the man were genuinely dead. I did not tell the family. I did not yet know who among them might already be complicit, and I feared, quite rightly as it turns out, that the wrong word to the wrong person might prove considerably more dangerous than silence. He looked, for the first time that evening, directly at Rupert. But I did tell one person. I told Rupert 3 days ago, because his debts to Faircross were the largest and most desperate in this house, and I believed he had a right to know the man he owed so much to had never truly died at all. Every eye in the room turned to Rupert, who sat very still, his face drained of colour, staring not at his accuser, but at the fire. I did not kill him, he said, for the 3rd time that night, though now his voice had lost its earlier panic, replaced by something flatter and more exhausted. I will admit that when Mr. Vance told me the truth, I went half mad with fury, that I had spent 3 days believing myself finally free of him, only to learn the debt still stood and would soon return to collect it. I said things at dinner I should not have said, but when I went out into the snow tonight, it was to walk off my own anger, not to seek him out. And when I found him already lying dead by that wall, I understood at once how it would look, and I very nearly did not call out for help at all, out of pure terror at what you would all believe. He looked up, at last, at Miss Marple. I did not strike that blow, I swear it before God. Miss Marple studied him for a long moment, and then, unexpectedly, nodded, as though some final piece of the pattern she had been assembling all evening had at last settled quietly into place. I believe you, Mr. Ashcombe, she said, because the person who struck that blow did not do so in a moment of drunken fury, discovered by chance in a dark garden. They came prepared, with a stone already selected, and waited at that wall for a man they knew, with certainty, would eventually walk that way, because they too had been told the truth of his survival, and unlike you, Mr. Ashcombe, they did not merely rage against it. They acted upon it, calmly, and with considerable premeditation, the moment the opportunity finally presented itself. She turned, at last, to where Colonel Ashcombe sat by the fire, his broad shoulders bowed, his weathered face turned away from thee.